Hello, everybody. Hello to Jim as well. Welcome to GapSummit Day 3. Thank you so much for joining us for this live Q&A session. How are you today?
Yeah, doing well, thanks, Robert. Privileged to be here. I'm sorry we can't all be together in person, but here we are. The technology's working.
Excellent. So I can see so many questions coming through on the Slido. So maybe we'll kick off with this first one here. So how can you use how can the use of data science and in silico disease models help us overcome the limitations inherent with animal models?
Overcome the limitations inherent in animal models. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, very big question, very challenging question. I think in silico models in general can really help us to deepen our understanding of disease. So maybe we'll come to the animal model part in a moment, but just in general, there are things we can do, for instance, massively networked knowledge graph approaches where we can bring together connected data that you couldn't get that information or that inference from any one scientific experiment. So there's just definitely something about the in silico approach that's going to give us hypotheses, findings, predictions about what happens when we hit this biological pathway with this drug, for instance, that definitely transcends us beyond the lab. And I would say how we translate between the lab bench, non-human experiments and human experiments is no exception to that. So I think we're already seeing places where we can do in silico experiments that mean we don't have to run the same number of animal experiments, and therefore we can cut that down and be more responsible as well, and refine our approach and accelerate those medicines into the clinic. So I think maybe the other point I would just add to finish that one off is, although the in silico approaches are catching up, it is still relatively difficult to kind of exactly emulate what happens in a biological system. So some degree of human and non-human experiments, we still require them because biology is a funny thing and it still needs to be tested in practice.
Absolutely, but that's great to hear that it's really aiding that translational process. So question 2, how can companies promote data sharing and integration while maintaining proprietary advantages of these data sets and resulting insights?
Oh, I've got a great example of that actually. So AstraZeneca recently, AstraZeneca is involved in an EU collaboration across a number of countries. It's called Melody. I think it stands for Machine Learning Ledger for Drug Discovery or something like that. And as the name suggests, it's so if you're familiar with blockchain and ledger-based techniques, it's a way of using distributed data to get more insight. So what happens in Melody is each of the pharmaceutical companies that are involved and different institutes are involved, they keep their data inside their firewall, right? So to that point about privacy and commercial confidentiality and so on, no company has to give its data up and put it in a central data lake. But we, and you can find this, there's the press release out there, we recently announced the first utilization of distributed AI over those distributed data sets. So you have a central algorithm that essentially goes and crawls across the data sets in the different companies. All companies in the consortium then get access to the results of that, but nobody gets to see anybody else's data. So you get to see your data, which is your special source, but you get the outputs of a model that was built on everybody's. And so I think these kind of approaches are good for pre-competitive science. They're more inclusive and they're more likely to get companies involved because they preserve confidentiality as well. So I'd love to see more of that going forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can definitely see the advantages there with so many people characterizing maybe similar problems and then coming together to solve, to really collate that data and learn from it. What do you think are the key barriers of applying AI and machine learning to drug discovery?
Yeah, there's a few, all of which I'm confident will conquer in time, but definitely this is what makes the field interesting because there are challenges. I think a key one is the data. So, most people, whether you work in AI or not, generally familiar with the concept that data is the fuel that drives a lot of these algorithms and models and predictions, forecasts, and so on. We've seen a lot of that this year, for instance, how that can be used to drive public policy and healthcare decision making and so forth. So if that data is not in a suitable state, if it's not cleaned and organized correctly, if it's biased in some way, that can lead us down the wrong path. So there's definitely a big challenge to making sure that any data that's fueling these AI technologies is fit for purpose. I think another area would be ethical considerations. So we need to learn as we go, I think, whether it's self-driving cars or it's algorithms to set a dose for a medicine for a patient. We need to understand the guardrails within which we should operate while still innovating, but being safe and ethical at the same time. And at AstraZeneca, we're about to put out a set of AI ethics guidelines on our website next month, actually. So again, these are very timely questions. It's like I could have made them up myself. I didn't, by the way. And a final area is the hype. So I like to think all of these areas are both sort of a positive and a challenge. So with the hype, I think it's great that people think that AI, in a way, is this panacea, because it means that the work that people like me and my colleagues are trying to do is kind of, people are enthusiastic about it and they support us. On the other hand, AI is not going to solve all the problems in the world. So we have to be careful it's not overhyped and the expectations aren't too far away from the reality.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And from your personal perspective, where do you think we are on that hype cycle? Because I think on some previous sessions, I think omics came in as something everyone was quite hyped about, and now AI is really coming in. Do you think there is a hype cycle with this, or do you think it could really stabilize and make a real impact as well?
It's going to be interesting to see, isn't it? I think if you follow the Gartner hype cycle model, and hope you all can picture that, with the climb up to the peak of overinflated expectations, and then the drop into the trough of disillusionment, and then the plateau of productivity, which is where you kind of average out, right? I think by some estimation, we might just be turning the corner on the peak of overinflated expectations. And so it might, and maybe we can mitigate this, but if it follows that standard cycle, then we are about to go into a phase where perhaps, because we're experimenting so widely with AI, there will be lots of failures from which we learn and go forward. But at the same time, that can dampen people's spirits a little. So I think it's about managing through that cycle, and whether the expectations are sort of high or low, keeping track of that and making sure, particularly where these things are more public, that public confidence is maintained.
Absolutely. So another question that's come in is, how do you deal with contradictory data when constructing knowledge graphs, and how can you assign relative importance to some data points over others?
Yeah, good one. I mean, there's a variety of ways of doing it, right? I think the good thing about knowledge graphs is there's enough richness in the way that the data and information is represented that you can take those sort of things into account. So for instance, there might be a connection in your graph that links a particular gene to a particular disease. For instance, is it implicated in the causation of that disease? And then you might find 12 publications, 8 of which say it is and 4 of which say it isn't. Now, ideally, we want to incorporate all that information because we want the benefit of all experimental results to sort of come to a reasoned conclusion. And then I think it's really down to, that's the first point to make. We wouldn't want to throw any of that away, assuming that's all trustworthy, they're from high quality peer-reviewed publications, etc. We would want to incorporate that. And then there's a number of things you can do, right? So you can sort of put weights on the connections between the nodes in the knowledge graph, or you can represent it visually due to the thickness of the lines. There's a lot of quite simple tricks that people use. And then, of course, if you then want to zoom in on that part of the graph, you could then click and maybe see some trust scores and things like that, depending on how strong the weight of evidence is one way or the other. And just going back to my point about, is the source trustworthy, and is it from a top scientific journal and stuff? I mean, some of it may not be, right? So if we try and bring all the latest breaking results into a knowledge graph, you're probably including something that somebody said at a conference as well. You don't want to miss that, but it's also not made its way through a peer review process into a scientific journal. So again, you might assign that, until it's been properly validated, a slightly lower level of trust than something that you find in a journal. And again, you would use that to generate the weightings in a graph connection.
And just to pick up on that last point, it's more, I guess it speaks a bit more broadly into your own perspectives on how information is communicated within the scientific community. But in terms of publications and the peer review process, and it can be quite a dynamic and driven by personal perspective. As a data scientist, when you're collating together this information, do you have perspectives there on this way that we communicate information within science?
In short, I think it's a problem. Don't get me wrong. I think all experimental results should go through a rigorous review process, should be subjected to public scrutiny, and should be published for all to see. So I don't have any problem with the process, but I think what lurks in the minds of most objective thinkers in this space when they're trying to sort of pull all that information together is things like the file drawer effect. Yeah, the idea that over time, whether knowingly or subconsciously, scientists have a sort of tendency to have more energy around publishing their positive findings, which they get excited about, and may result in future grant approvals and things of that nature, and maybe less time sort of presenting the results of what are perceived to be less successful experiments. Of course, ideally, we want everything. We want to know everything that everybody's found. And that's why it's called the file drawer effect, right? Because there was this notion back in the day that you put those results in your file drawer and you sort of get to those later, and maybe they never saw the light of day. So I don't have an easy answer to it, but I do think it's an issue. I think where we see some efforts to try to understand that a bit more is if you look in the field of like meta-analysis. So where there's been a number of clinical studies, for instance, looking at a particular effect, and then you combine the high-level results from those, given the tolerance of the errors within which their results were measured, they should follow a certain shape and they should follow a certain trend. And if there's a gap in that graph, that normally tells you there's some results somewhere that are missing, or your knowledge is incomplete. So it's not a perfectly solved problem, Robert, but there are things we can do to sort of say, we do think there's a gap in our knowledge here, so we need to be wary of that.
Absolutely. And just to speak to another gap now, so how can we bridge the gap between the availability of new types of data and translation to robust evidence with regulators and HTA bodies that they are willing to accept?
Yeah, they're asking all the big questions today. So I mean, might be best sort of thought of or speculated upon with an example, right? So one example of one of those new data streams are the sort of myriad devices and health sensors and wearable gadgets and things that people are increasingly used to monitor their health status, some of which are now sort of drifting into that validated regulatory space, particularly when they're used then to make a real medical decision rather than just, sort of count steps or monitor my sleep or whatever it is. And in those cases, I think it's starting to sound like my standard answer, but it's an ongoing process. It's a journey which we're just part way through. I think a lot of the regulators and health authorities have really got their heads around how to handle a physical device that's making medical decisions when that's applied in a certain context, and there'll be certain regulations and guidance, and you need to get a rubber stamp to validate that. Where I think we've got more work to do is where there's an AI type algorithm that's going to adapt and learn over time and learn new patterns, because that's what AI is good at. How do you validate that? There's been some really interesting work from the FDA, the US regulator, sort of looking at how you might apply regulatory frameworks in that kind of adaptive modeling paradigm. So I think the future's bright there, but absolutely it's not been solved yet, and it's something the world needs to grapple with as these new data streams come online, but also as new devices come online and we increasingly apply AI type algorithms to them.
Absolutely. And I think picking up on some of those wearables and digital health, there's a few questions coming in which relate to early detection and preventing disease. And do you think this advent of digital health and wearables, that there is a risk that from all these patterns we can overdiagnose patients at times and detect indolent disease?
Yeah, so I think we need to be careful, right? I think from one point of view, I mean, what's wrong with early detection, right? We'd all want to know 6 months ahead of time. Or maybe not all of us would. Not everybody wants to know the future, but many of us may want to know 6 months ahead of time if we're going to be at risk of a particular medical event, particularly if we can do something about it within that 6 months that might reduce that probability or mitigate that effect. And I think if we can collect more data that kind of enables us to do that in a sensible way, that's great. Are we at risk of overdiagnosing? So I suppose being an AI professional, not a medical professional, I'll give you my AI professional's answer, which is in my world, this comes down to the accuracy of those predictions, right? The accuracy of those algorithms. How specific or sensitive are they? What's the precision and the recall? The usual metrics we'd look at in fields like machine learning and predictive analytics. And I think where we might have to close the gap, we're talking about gaps, aren't we, a lot in the GapSummit, which is fitting, is sort of between the public understanding of risk and what these various algorithms are telling us. So I'd kind of like to see the world move to a place where most people who are considering their health status also have a good sense of what it means when a device or an algorithm gives them a probability of some event. People are not used to thinking in terms of risk and probabilistic outcomes. But I think if we can educate people such that they are, then I think we'll reduce the risk of sort of overreacting to some of these predictions.
Absolutely. I think from a clinical and medical perspective, communicating risk is a challenge that comes up all the time. So absolutely. Another question has come in saying, which mentions when testing AI algorithms, for example, for immunohistochemistry, how do you establish ground truth for calculating error rate independent of human assessment?
Yeah, another great question. In some settings, there almost is no ground truth per se. So IHC is a good example. You can obviously use the human assessment as a ground truth. The issue with that, which I think the person that answered the questions probably figured out, is well, that's not really the ground truth if you're then saying a machine can do it better. So I think, there's kind of ways you can work around that, all of which are probably imperfect in some degree. So one way is, instead of to use a single human annotator, you use several. You then independently, so they don't see each other's results, you get an assessment across them all, which at least stands a chance of being less biased and potentially more objective. So it might be closer to a ground truth. Another way you can do it is you can simulate the data. So methods are getting more and more sophisticated these days at generating synthetic data. So then, of course, you know what the ground truth is, because that's what you've coded into the simulation software that's generated the pretend images. And then you get the AI to assess the image and see how well it does. And where one of the more recent advances over the last 2 or 3 years with neural networks that we've seen that specifically does this is adversarial approaches. So you have one neural network that kind of generates examples and the other one that tries to discriminate or classify those examples. So people might have heard of these as GANs, generative adversarial networks, where one neural network tries to fool the other. So there's some tricks that you can do to kind of get the computer to generate the ground truth if you don't know it as a human, and then additionally get another computer, if you like, then to do the accuracy assessment.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. Really interesting stuff. So another question has come in saying, how long do you expect the Google Maps of cancer will take to develop? Will you integrate this data with other global projects such as Human Cell Atlas?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably a bit like the regular Google Maps, it can be available pretty quickly, you know, in a year or two, after sort of doing the hard work of sending the video cars around all the streets and so on. Or perhaps, well, no, sorry, you don't even need to do that, do you? To get started, you need your maps and perhaps some satellite images, and then the street view and stuff like that was added on later, right? So there, my roundabout answer to this one is there's probably no end to it, because if something like the Google Maps of cancer serves its purpose well, it shouldn't be finite, right? It should generate so many more hypotheses and findings that then kick off new experiments, collaborations, partnerships, startups that then discover new data that feeds back in. So from that point of view, there'll be a degree of amorphousness and infiniteness to it. So, you know, I would think could be a bulk of work over a year or two where you could stand up something that you could call a version 1 of a Google Maps of cancer, and then allow it to evolve after that. And you might add in things like the resource the person asking the question mentioned. You know, these human genome atlases, the various public resources can be pulled in one by one.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Are digital health systems more useful for personalized healthcare or population level systems? And what are the differences in the type of data used for each?
Yeah, interesting. Clearly, there are examples of both, right? And we try to use digital systems, technologies, data, AI for both those examples. I mean, with population trends, right? I mean, we've had a fascinating example this year, right, with how governments and bodies have tried to use population level data both to help explain and be more transparent with their populations, but also make very real health policy decisions that can change the direction of a nation. And you know, what we found in the UK, for instance, was because we hadn't necessarily spent the last 10 years preparing for a COVID-19 pandemic, because it was sort of a black swan event, we had some disparate data sets and digital resources that didn't necessarily talk to each other as effectively as they might have. And so that produced some of the difficulties that people might have observed, particularly early in the pandemic, where we didn't sort of know which models to trust or whether we had enough data to really profile the population or see where things are going. So I think with the population level stuff, you really need to have your, in this case, public health resources joined up, collecting data consistently, and then have some agreed and importantly open models in terms of how you're then going to use that for decision making. And again, we saw the whole discussion and debate about how, you know, should the people building the epidemiological models for COVID, for instance, should they just all be making just their code public so that anybody can scrutinize it and comment on it? Really an interesting debate about transparency there. And then if you sort of go to the other end of the scale, I think the question was probably trying to get at a dichotomy or two ends of a spectrum, where you look at precision medicine or personalized medicine, you're really now trying to tailor individual medical decisions, perhaps for each and every individual, So I or you may want all our data to be considered so that our healthcare professional can make the very best tailored decision for us. At least that's how I feel about it. I'm sort of happy to give my data up for that, as long as I think I'm going to get something out of it. So then, rather than being a statistic in a wider population, I would want more to be known about me. It might just be my preference, but I'd kind of want some information about my genome and my proteome and my medical history, and kind of a lot of these other more detailed kind of micro measurements that make up my physiology, to help make a personalized treatment decision for me.
Thanks, Jim. I have one final question for you, just almost out of time, but it's been a fantastic discussion. And if you could tie in with this final question, any thoughts you'd like to leave our leaders of tomorrow with today? So with the advent of AI and machine learning, how can the traditional bench scientist be employable in big data, computational focused biotech industry?
Right. So I think, again, this is a gap we should actively work to close. And again, I can give an example because it's close to home, because it's something we're currently doing in AstraZeneca, where we've got lab-based scientists that may not be data scientists by original training, and then we have a bunch of AI technologies that can potentially give these individuals an advantage and help them do better science or augment the science they're doing. And we try and approach it by closing the gap from both sides. So by both, so we're rolling out something called our Data Science Academy, for instance, for which those, should we call them, non-data scientists, can become more data savvy and learn more about data science. So they sort of move closer to the technology, but also that we continue to evolve the technologies and solutions so that they become more user friendly, and we kind of meet people halfway. So we provide technologies and AI solutions that are more applicable and understandable and user-friendly in a lab environment, but also that we help support our lab colleagues by giving them the training and support so that they can upskill and meet those technologies halfway.
That makes a lot of sense, and everyone has a role to play, it sounds.
Absolutely. No, it's been a pleasure, Robert. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jim. That was a really interesting discussion. I will just finish with a closing note with our leaders of tomorrow. So we have around 15 minutes break now before we transition to the workshop sessions. So you will see on your web portal on the left-hand panel the tab which says workshops, and the link to the workshop that you've been allocated, with the PDF there with the workshops that you're going to be participating in today. Please ensure you join your workshop promptly, ensure you click the right link, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much, Jim, again.
Thanks, Robert. Pleasure. Take care, everyone.